Everybody, it's Christian Sellers here, CEO of TESS. I wanted to share some research that we've done over the last 6 months in Rwanda. We've done this with about 15 leaders from 8 or 9 different companies. And yeah, just wanted to share some comparisons that I pulled out from the database, looking at the most effective leaders, those leaders that have the biggest positive impact versus the least effective leaders, and whether that gives us any insights into leadership strategies that are proving most effective in the Rwandan business context. So yeah, the basic conclusion, it's here in the title. The most effective leaders are the ones that are supportive, the ones that help their reports and colleagues to be successful. They're inclusive, they involve others in decision-making and involve others in the processes that they have to manage. And lastly, they're kind, they're generous with praise, they share information, and they work towards the success of others. That's some of the conclusions, but let me take you into the model and some of the findings to expand a bit further. So I've been very fortunate in Rwanda of using one of the best instruments for measuring leadership impact that there is. This is the Human Synergistics Leadership Impacts Survey. And the model essentially is quite simple. It does surveys, 360 surveys of usually 3 to 12 reports and peers of the leaders that you're investigating. And it basically asks questions about 4 things. The first is the ideal. What is the model that the leader themselves brings to their work? What do they see as being good leadership? And then what strategies do others see them actually using in the workplace? How are they supporting different types of work or restricting certain types of work? And then what impact does that have? How does that shape the behaviors that they encourage in others? And lastly, then how does that lead to a business result in terms of their personal and organizational effectiveness? So I have data from all of these leaders across these dimensions, and it's a really rich data set to drill into what are some of the things that seem to make the most difference in terms of driving the effectiveness of the best leaders. The one thing that's quite interesting is there's not much difference in terms of the ideal. So this is from the surveys with these 15 leaders themselves. And what I have here is a comparison between the top 5 leaders, and those are the leaders that are shown in blue, red, and green. So if you look at the dimensions here, these are all leadership behaviors encouraged by these leaders that are constructive or less constructive. And you can see that the ideal for the most constructive leaders is very, very constructive. Sorry, the most effective leaders, it's very blue. So they're focused on goal setting, on achievement, on encouraging people and building good teams. And that's also actually the same for the least effective leaders. The least effective leaders I've mapped out here in purple. You can see, if anything, their constructive model is actually a little bit more constructive than the most effective leaders. But in the other dimensions, the more defensive dimensions, both aggressive and passive, you can see that the least effective leaders are slightly more have slightly more aggressive and passive behaviors as part of their ideal, but it's not particularly pronounced. It's generally around the average that we've seen across all the surveys that have been done, that Human Synergistics have done over time. So again, the ideals are fairly similar. There's not much differentiation. Where we do see some differentiation is in the strategies that these leaders actually are exhibiting in the workplace. What do they actually do with their time? And we can see that the effective leaders spend more time mentoring constructively their peers and their reports. So much more time encouraging people, showing them how to work effectively, showing them the ropes, training them. There's more of that. And you can see that under the mentoring bar. You can see there's more blue, and that light blue is the difference between the most and least effective leaders. And you can see the most effective leaders are doing this more. And likewise, other interpersonal things that the most effective leaders do more of, they do more positive monitoring, looking for success, and more positive reinforcement in giving feedback. But in addition, they do less negative monitoring, less looking for mistakes, and less corrective feedback as well. Likewise, in the organizational context, influencing the broader organization, creating a setting for other people's success, there's much more positive prescriptive strategies that are evident here that you can see, and also less restrictive, less control, preventing people from doing things as well. So you can see a more constructive, or at least a more prescriptive leadership style emerging from the most effective leaders. Where you see this having dramatic effect is on the impact side. And we saw before that using the human synergistics model, the circumplex, the ideals for both least and most effective leaders are quite similar, but the actual impact that other people report about these leaders is dramatically different, particularly on two dimensions, which is humanism and affiliation. Even though the least effective leaders know that they should be encouraging people, they should be building much teams, other people don't see it. And you can see that here because that purple mapping of the least effective leaders, doesn't even reach the average for humanism and for affiliation. Whereas for the most effective leaders, it's right at the 100th percentile. So clearly these are very effective leaders, even compared to the international norms. Where the least effective leaders do have more prominent extensions is on the aggressive side. So you'll see that they're much more likely to encourage competition and much more likely to be oppositional, to find mistakes, to create their influence and power by finding errors that other people are making, being less likely to be impressed than the most effective leaders. So these are things that are quite different between them. And that then draws into the effectiveness. This is just a breakdown. We already know, obviously, the top 5 effective leaders are the most effective relative to the least. But where is that effectiveness felt? It's mainly felt in interpersonal dimensions, where the most effective leaders enhance other people's productivity, make them feel empowered, and also encourage organizational adaptability. And at a personal level, they're much more open to feedback. The least effective leaders don't like being told how to correct things or how to do things better. They tend to be more defensive. So this is interesting as well. If you pull all of this together, I've mapped out here what were those dimensions of these different parts of the surveys, the leadership strategies, the impact, the effectiveness, where the most effective leaders have the highest scores relative to the least. And those scores are put in the little bubbles next to these particular dimensions. And you can see that humanistic encouraging, as I mentioned, is the most powerful impact that these leaders have, the most effective leaders have relative to the least. And it's largely mentoring and influencing that seem to be driving that. But then on the less effective side, in terms of competitive and oppositional behavior, again, you see that the least effective leaders are more likely to use restrictive strategies there, pointing out things that they don't like, giving people negative feedback, restricting their discretion in making decisions or doing things. See that feeding through the model. And so if you try and tease out from all of this, what are the real dimensions? What are the kind of real hacks that the most effective leaders have that are enhancing their effectiveness? I try to drill it down to basically 3 things. The first is that the most effective leaders are far more supportive. They give time and guidance to people who need it, and they empathize. They really understand their organizations from the perspective of someone who's struggling or someone who's new, and they work with those people to help them be successful. Likewise, they're far more likely than the least effective leaders to include people affected by their decisions in the decision-making process. They use inclusive decision-making processes, and also they use their own position to help increase other people's discretion. Whereas the least effective leaders often use their power to close people down and prevent them from doing things. So you have this much more empowering approach to decision-making. And the last point is around kindness. Most effective leaders are spending a lot of time giving others information and resources that they need to be successful. They also are very generous in their praise and supporting others. And lastly, they're much less likely to use correction liberally, whereas least effective leaders often spend time correcting people, which we know is highly demotivating and knocks people's confidence. So the most effective leaders in our surveys, they're supportive, they're inclusive, and they show kindness. So yeah, these are really interesting results. I hope you've enjoyed them as much as I have. I will be talking a little bit more about this at Norsken House next Thursday. So if you want to hear more, please come along. Or if in more general, you'd like to talk, or you'd like to do surveys like this in your own organization, please reach out. Thank you for your listening and thank you for your attention. Cheers.